Today I'm looking at a kit that I always kind of wanted as a kid. I knew it existed, I could see it in the catalogues, but it was never one that actually made its way onto my... Well, I didn't have a workbench back then, but I had like a tray where I used to just build stuff. And I thought that I would get one, and I never did, until Airfix re-announced its entry back into the range back in 2023. So I now have my hands on a Brewster Buffalo in 1/72 scale from Airfix. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and to kind of do a little bit of a testament to this kit in the way that I probably would have built it if I'd had the chance to build it in my youth, I'm going to be doing this as a back to basics build of the Brewster Buffalo. So join me on the workbench today as I build and review this kit and see what this is like. So being a back to basics build, this one's not going to feature much in the way of airbrushing. It's not going to feature an airbrush at all. Instead, it's going to focus on skills and techniques that I kind of would have had access to in my youth. So at the very least, it's going to feature some simple techniques, but also I want to make a bit of a return to using enamel paints. I don't really use enamels as much as I used to, but I do have quite a stash of them, so it would be nice to use them up. So let's get into this. As usual, I'm going to put a list of the products I used on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you'd like to have a go at this one for yourself. As mentioned, I'm going to be building the model in this video, but for a closer look at the contents of the box, such as the sprues, instructions and transfers, take a look at the dedicated unboxing video I've already made on that topic. As usual, I'm going to be cutting the plastic parts away from their runners by using my side cutters and then sanding down any rough areas or flash using a sanding stick or perhaps a sharp knife. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice during this build, and I started by gluing the upper wing components onto the lower wing. After this, I glued in the clear window part which goes in the floor of the cockpit. I did use the extra thin cement here just carefully, in a hope that it wouldn't fog up the plastic but would give a stronger bond. After this, the pilot's chair was cemented into place on its mounting part which goes inside the cockpit. I then decided that I would paint all the internal areas using this Vallejo khaki. It may not be the most accurate internal green colour for this kind of aircraft, but I think because it was like an American plane, they would have had a slightly more yellow version of the cockpit green than the one that the British manufacturers would have used. A couple of thin coats would be needed here and there just to ensure that I had a good coverage of this paint colour. After this, I used Vallejo silver on the pilot's chair. I then glued the chair and its sort of cockpit floor component into place on the lower wing, and then Vallejo US Field Drab was used as the overall colour for the pilot figure. A little more Vallejo silver was used on his goggles, and some khaki was used on his gloves. Some Humbrol 61 flesh was used on his face, and Vallejo black was used on his boots. Whilst I had that black paint out, I'd actually thin it down with a bit of water to turn it into a wash, and then apply this to the figure to run into those recessed details and try and bring them out. And with that done, I glued the pilot figure into place on his chair. There are no real cockpit details inside of this aircraft, which is a shame, especially seeing as you have a cockpit canopy at the top and these little windows at the bottom where you could potentially see things. Now, the tail on this Buffalo kit isn't quite accurate to a version that would be used by the RAF. The version really sort of represents one that would have been used by the US Navy and as a result would have a tail hook in it. The RAF version wouldn't have had a tail hook but would instead have had like more of a fuselage fairing that goes over that bit of the tail. So I tried to replicate this using a piece of plastic. This is actually a landing gear cover from a BF 109 kit I built a little while ago. Effectively, I just glued it into place where this fairing should go, snipped it to kind of the right shape using my side cutters, and would then sand it down to have a better profile. Sadly, this kit doesn't come with a vintage display stand, but it does have a marking for where one would go. I do have some vintage display stands in my stash, so I'm going to display this aircraft in a flying pose. This slot in the bottom of the aircraft needs to be opened up so that I can display it on the stand. I carefully cut this slot using my snips and my knife. When that was done, I glued the two fuselage halves together. Generally, the alignment of these parts is quite good, but I will have to address a few areas a little bit later on. In particular, I did have to pay a little bit of attention to that fairing I've installed at the back, just to make sure it looked a bit more uniform with the rest of the model. I'm not entirely sure what this component is, but you can see that I've painted it off camera and it was glued into place at the back of the cockpit. After this, I glued the wings onto the fuselage, and then the horizontal tail surfaces could also be glued into their slots at the back of the tail. To address some of the small gaps and things, I'm going to use some of this Ammo MIG putty surfacer. It's carefully painted into the areas which need a little bit of attention and then left to dry. Once it's dried, it can then be carefully sanded down to hide any gaps. I do have to be careful though, because this model features a lot of raised rivets and I don't really want to remove them. Now I decided to glue into place the clear canopy. I've decided that I will just use the Tamiya cement, just being super careful with my placement of it. The canopy comes in 3 parts, and I think you probably could display the canopy in an open position if you wanted to, but I decided that I would have mine closed, just to make sure the pilot was protected whilst he was flying the plane. I've been very fortunate to receive a free sample of the CT scale models mask set for this kit. Not only does this mask set feature comprehensive instructions on where the small pieces of masking tape should go, it does also provide a little bit of historical background at times as well. There are more masks included on this sheet than I actually need to use, such as for the band on the propeller, air intakes on the engine, and the wheels. I will just free paint those. But I will use all of the ones for the main canopy and the lower window. This is definitely the perfect kit for a mask set, as it does feature lots of fiddly little windows, and had I used my normal masking technique to do this, I probably would have ended up throwing this model against a wall. But the CT scale models mask set makes this step so much more easier and enjoyable. The relevant masks were simply peeled from their backing paper and stuck into the correct place on the aircraft. I've been very fortunate that CT scale models have sent me out some samples over the last few builds, and I can genuinely say that I am impressed with this particular product line. With that done, I glued the engine onto the front of the aircraft. And it is worth noting that you can have a freely rotating prop if you build this as per the instructions. However, I'm not following the instructions here, and I'm just doing my own thing. I then glued into place the mast for the aerial, and this was followed by the correct tail wheel for the RAF version. I assembled the 3 parts which make up the engine cowling, and this was then also glued into place on the front of the aircraft. Now, we need to talk about the landing gear on this kit. So this kit does come with the option to have the landing gear raised or lowered. Parts for those specific options are included in the kit. I've decided that I'm going to have mine in the raised position because I want it to look like it's flying at the end, particularly as I'm going to be using a display stand. However, as this is a vintage model, the instructions from 1972 make indication of which parts you need to use for the landing gear in its lowered position and in its raised position, as they are not the same parts, they have a different shape, and you can't use them for the same purposes. Interestingly, the instructions with this 2023 release don't tell you about the raised landing gear option. They completely omit that. You still get the parts, but you're not told how to use them, which I find is a very strange decision, seeing as they were included in previous versions of this kit. But anyways, I glued together the relevant parts that I needed for my raised landing gear, and then glued them into the slots in the lower wing surfaces. I then glued the hubs into the centre of the wheels. This aircraft did have an element of play value designed into it, as was quite typical of model kits of the 70s. If you glue this in correctly, you could have a tyre that freely rotates, but I don't really see the point in that, so I'm just going to glue all of mine nice and solid. And now it's time to prime. I'm going to be using Tamiya Fine Surface Primer, but this time in grey. A few thin coats of this paint would be applied over the entire aircraft, as well as the other bits and pieces which are still waiting to go onto the model. When that was done, I would paint the internal areas of the engine with some Vallejo gunmetal. And as mentioned, I'm going to be using enamels for the main paintwork on this aircraft. I've had these in my stash for a number of years now, and I kind of want to use them up. Fortunately, I do have all the right colours. I will though make sure to thin them down just a little bit with some enamel thinner, just to help them flow a little bit better. But I did have to make sure that I gave all of my enamel paints a good thorough mix before using them, especially given that I haven't used them in years and they kind of have separated out. But fortunately, they are still completely usable. First up was the Humbrol 90 Beige Green. A couple of thin coats of this paint would be applied to the lower surfaces of the aircraft. I decided when all of that was dry that I would mask the fuselage band using some masking tape. A decal is included if you want to use that, however I just thought this would be easier and give a closer colour match to the paint that I'm actually using. To help ensure that I didn't get any paint bleed underneath this tape, I added a small amount of the Humbrol 90 just around the outside edges, to act as a barrier for the next colours of paint that would be used. And speaking of the next colour of paint, it's Humbrol 29 Dark Earth, again another enamel paint. This was carefully painted onto all of the upper surfaces, and a couple of thin coats would be needed to get the right level of opacity. I would have to take my time and use a bit of patience just to get a nice clean edge where the upper camouflage scheme meets the lower beige colour I painted previously, as I've decided not to mask that part. Enamels do have a notoriously long drying time, which in some respects is really good because it actually allows the paint to sort of self-level as it dries and avoid leaving brush marks, especially given the fact I've also thinned this paint, it will have a slightly longer drying time. It was quite good for me because although this model kit took a little while to build, I actually managed to fit it around other commitments, so before work or after work I could actually put a layer of paint on and it would dry and be ready for when I could come back and actually do some more work on it. So whilst that paint was drying, I decided that I would move on to the propeller. The propeller spinner has already been painted with the beige colour, and I very carefully used some Vallejo black to paint the band around the back of the spinner as indicated by the instructions. I would also use this paint to carefully pick out the tyres, again doing so very carefully freehand. The prop was much easier to do because that was just painted black in its entirety. But when that was dry, some Humbrol 24 Trainer Yellow was used to pick out the warning flashes at the tips of the propeller blades. And now I can return back to the aircraft. Humbrol 30 Dark Green is now carefully painted on, more or less following the painting instructions. This will replicate the camouflage scheme, and this was just done completely freehand. This colour is quite good really, and I only actually needed one coat of this in order to get a good finish. And when that was dry, I carefully peeled away the masking tape which has been protecting the band on the fuselage, and it's done a really good job. To protect all of this paintwork and give it a more uniform finish, I used some 135 satin varnish. This was simply from a spray can and applied over the entire aircraft. And now I can turn my attention to the decals. These are printed by Cartograph and are to the usual high quality we can expect from them. The printing is excellent and the registration of the colours is really good too. The RAF version actually comes with slightly fewer transfers. So if you don't really like transfers, this is the version to go for. The sheet was cut into more manageable pieces, having selected the transfers that I wanted to use. And then they were soaked into warm water to release them from the backing paper. Microscale, set and sol will be my setting solutions of choice throughout this build, and the first one to use is Micro Set from the blue bottle. This was painted onto the areas of the aircraft where the transfers were going to go. The transfers were then slid into position, having released from their water-soaked backing paper, and carefully aligned as per the painting instructions. Some more microset could then be applied, and this will help soften the transfers into all of those rivet details. I generally didn't have too much of a problem with the transfer application, it was relatively straightforward. However, I did find that the registration letters or the identification codes on the side of the aircraft were a little bit too big. That letter B either ends up folding over the top of the wing surface or covering up part of the canopy. I feel like the scaling on this is a little bit too big and maybe should be ever so slightly smaller. Once those decals were in place and had settled down onto the surface details, some micro sol from the red bottle was brushed over the top to further soften and settle them into those surface details. And having left them overnight to cure, I then gave them a further coat of 135 satin just to protect them and again give a uniform finish with the rest of the aircraft. The Vallejo silver made a reappearance here and was used for some subtle chipping effects around the areas which potentially may have seen some paint wear away. I thought the wing roots where the crew or pilot would climb onto the aircraft, and also around the areas where panels may have been removed for maintenance. I also applied some of this silver paint in a dry brushing technique to bring out some of those rivet details as well. Next up are some Humbrol aging powders. This was a free sample that was provided by Humbrol a little while ago, and I think I'm starting to get the hang of using them. I used a mix of the smoke and black powders to replicate engine exhausts and staining from the gun barrels. These pigments are loaded onto a dry brush and then brushed onto the model in the direction of airflow. I just had to be careful not to overload the brush and effectively ruin the paint finish. Now it's time to glue the propeller onto the spinner, and then when that was done, it was time to glue on the wheels. I did find that the hole for the wheels wasn't quite big enough to go onto the mounting points on the model, so I carefully opened these up using a drill bit. And with that done, they were carefully glued into place. As mentioned previously, I don't really care about having a propeller that rotates in this build, so it was just glued into place on the engine. I then carefully peeled away all of the CT scale model masks, making sure not to forget the ones on the lower side of the aircraft as well. That window in the floor of the cockpit would have been used to help the pilot during landing procedures. A good old-fashioned technique to add some aerial wires is to stretch some sprue using some slightly melted plastic. So I heated it up and then stretched it out to make a thin wire. This was then carefully glued into place at the top of the tail and on the aerial mast on the nose. When that was dry, some gunmetal paint was carefully painted onto the wire to try and blend it in and make it not look so obvious. And the final step in this build is to dig out those vintage display stands which I've got lying around in my stash, assemble one, and then attach the finished model to it. And with that, I'm calling my back to basics build of the Brewster Buffalo complete. Well, there we go. I'm pretty happy with this one. I think on the whole it was quite a fun and enjoyable experience. There were some small issues which we'll talk about imminently, but yeah, on the whole, not a particularly bad model. Granted, it's not up to today's standards, it is a bit of a clunky kit, but I think the way that I've done it in a back to basics way, using techniques and, you know, some of the paints that effectively I still had from my youth, it was all right. It was nice to go back to that, and I'd love to go back to that sort of modelling more frequently. I do naturally keep all of my notes in my journal, and you can purchase these online to keep track of your own builds. Links in the description. And it says in here that this took me 9 days. But as mentioned, because you've got that long drying time and the fact that I was so busy with other things, you know, work and family, it was a pick up and put down kind of model. I made progress on it when I had the chance to do so. So let's talk about a few issues with the kit that I found. There are gaps in places which I had to fill. You've got all those raised rivets, and actually if you look closely at the aircraft, you'll notice that what I did when I was coming to apply the transfers is that some of them are slightly like asymmetrical, so the rivets on the left wing are not quite in the same place as the rivets on the right wing. I don't know if that was prototypical, but it just seemed a little bit off to me. As mentioned during the build, the decals are beautiful, however the fuselage ones, that letter B, or I think in general, they are ever so slightly too large, and they do either fold onto the lower wing surface or cover part of the canopy, which is disappointing that they're not quite the right size. I feel like maybe had they been scaled down by a millimeter or two, we may have avoided that issue. So it's a bit unusual to have decals that aren't quite scaled correctly from Airfix. The quality though, absolutely lovely. As mentioned previously, we have the lower tail, the very back of the plane is incorrect for an RAF version, which I fixed by using some plastic from another kit. As mentioned, this is a kit that is ultimately designed to be a US Navy aircraft with a tail hook, and that's where it would stick out. But we don't need that one, but Airfix at the time when they designed this kit never allowed for that or included a part to make that correct. The lack of cockpit details, whilst maybe a little bit frustrating, in hindsight aren't as noticeable as I thought they probably would be, but if you go looking for them, you're not going to find them. The fact that you've got a pilot included does go some way to help hide them, and that's effectively what I did. Including the pilot and making this fly kind of prevents you from seeing through all those windows and noticing that there's nothing there. Oh yeah, and the fact that the instructions make no reference to the raised landing gear components when they have done in the past was a little bit misleading, but thanks to some research I managed to figure out what was going on and which parts should have actually gone where. The fact that they're still included in the kit but not mentioned is a bit of a weird one. I think though that is pretty much all the issues I had with the kit as it kind of stands. Yes, it's a little bit clunky, it's a little bit old, it's not up to today's standards, but it is a relatively alright kit to build, and I had quite a bit of fun doing so. There was one thing that I had a problem with though, and this comes down to my own modelling skills, or sort of maybe an element of impatience. On the lower side of the aircraft, the beige green went on lovely, but then when I used the spray varnish, I applied too much too quickly, and it has caused a slight orange peel crackling effect in the paint. It hasn't done it on the upper surfaces, but it has done it on the lower surfaces. You can't really notice it unless you look for it. If you get up close, you can see it, but from normal viewing distances, you can't. I did think about trying to fix it, but actually I can live with it, especially as it's now flying on my shelf and you can't really notice it. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about this kit. This kit made a reappearance in the Airfix range in 2023, and I'm pretty sure I had it as a pre-order so that I didn't miss out on getting one. Its original tooling date though is 1972, and I think that is kind of evident in the fact that it has all those raised details, it's missing cockpit details, and it does have an element of play value as well, with the wheels that supposedly could rotate freely and a prop that could spin if you built it as per the instructions and didn't go off and do your own thing like I did. The recommended retail price at the time that I purchased this was £10.99, but naturally prices don't remain the same all the time, and we may find that if this makes a reappearance it won't be that price again. Personally, I do think £10.99 for this kit is a little bit steep, but then you are getting a choice of 2 transfer schemes, and actually the American version would probably be better value for money because you end up using more transfers than you do with the RAF version. Personally, I probably would have preferred to get this one for a few pounds cheaper, given the fact that you only have 42 parts included, and depending on which version you build you don't even use all the parts, and ultimately you end up with a pretty small plane. The Buffalo wasn't a big fighter aircraft, and the model is no exception either. It's not a lot of plastic for your £10.99. But yeah, I think that is pretty much it. And this is probably the right place to wrap this one up. I had hoped that this would be a really quick video, but I know that I have been talking for like 45 minutes now, and that means I have a lot of editing to do. So in conclusion, this is an old model which, whilst it can be a fun build, is not up to today's standards. I have built another Buffalo from another company, and that was a much more modern tooling, and despite it also having a few little issues, if I was going for a more modern version, that would be the one I would pick. This one does hark back to an age of raised rivets, questionable fit, and an element of play value. And whilst still a fun model kit to build today, perhaps it wasn't quite worth what they were asking for it. And on that bombshell, it's probably time to finish here. Shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. A massive thanks to these guys on screen. If you'd like to join them, take a look at the links in the description to find out what becoming a Model Club member means. Alternatively, if you'd like to support the channel in other ways, once again there is more information underneath the video. The best way to support this channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on, so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. Brewster Buffalo back to basics build. Sync, because it's never in sync. Need a clapperboard, one of those. I also need to throw this in. Always forgetting stuff. The CT scale model masks are absolutely fantastic, but I did find that I had a little bit of paint bleed underneath them. It's not massively noticeable unless you are kind of looking for it, but I can notice it in the finished model. I think that's down to the fact that I hand painted on a liquid paint and it has seeped under the masks in a few places. Some of the canopy frames do have an odd curve right at the top of them, which perhaps is where they've crept in. On the whole, the mask sets are great. They are perfectly sized and cut and really easy to use. But I did have a little bit of seepage underneath there, which is possibly a combination of, as mentioned, the liquid paint seeping underneath, and also maybe me not sticking the masks down quite enough to ensure a good adhesion to the surface. A little bit disappointing, but something else to keep an eye out for in future builds. After this, the pilot's chair was cemented into its position. Blah, 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 blah. Right, that's it, I'm done. I did mention my book, and this has lots of bits left in it to go. Oh no, don't, they're all here. What's in here? Oh, it's just the instructions. Yeah, oh, and a clear and a canopy and transfers. So there is stuff from this kit to go in the spares box. So we'll have to make sure I do that. Brewster Buffalo, part 2. I need to get a clapperboard. Definitely get a clapperboard. Where did we get to? And speaking of the next colour of paint, it was Humbrol 30. No, it isn't. Oh, I made that too sweet.